Encounter Talks with Don at Gessner Ministries, a forum for discussing challenging topics, dissecting truth, discovering hope and light in a world that desperately needs revival.
Wes, I really enjoyed the message on Wednesday, the message that you brought about faith.
Thank you.
It was a really good message, and so let's just talk about a few of those points today. I know that you had 5 points. We'll probably touch on all of them, but the first one was about a faith that is a bit more simple than what we sometimes make it, and I was intrigued by that because, you know, you made a reference in that area about the fact that I think what we often do is we only see our mountain,
Right.
and the magnitude of that, instead of seeing the power of God, which is all the difference in the world in that. But I just wanted you to build on that for me for a moment.
Well, I mean, to me, it was the story of the walls of Jericho coming down, and that's a walled city. It was formidable. You know, they might have had other ways to scheme to try to get in there and do what they needed to do.
But it seemed pretty insurmountable.
Right.
Yeah.
So they just simply trusted God, which sounds simple. It's not as simple, but it is simple because they didn't have to do much. What they had to do was put themselves out there by walking around for 6 days, and then on the seventh day do it 7 times. And it was a simple plan, so it wasn't as strenuous as it would have been had they done it on their own.
Right.
We look at. I remember one time. This is. Now I got to be careful how I say this. This was a story that came out of Southern Indiana, and I remember somebody on the Wesleyan campground there was talking about a person who was always bringing up mountains. I mean, just always, everything was a mountain. Everything was huge. And when they weren't really huge, and this man had a peculiar sense of humor, and he finally said to him, I'm gonna buy you a bulldozer. And he said, what for? And he said, so you can make all those molehills into mountains. I'm not sure it was a good thing to say, but it's always stuck with me because we do that. We tend to just build it up and build it up and build it up and build it up and not rely on God as much as we should sometimes.
Yeah. Well, what exactly, though, was your point when you said faith is a bit more simple than we make it? Was it because what they were asked to do was a simple act?
Right.
Because when I think of the faith piece and it being simple, sometimes it's really tough to be able to trust, at least for me.
It's not simple to trust, but it is simple. Sometimes what God does, what he does is way more complicated than what we have to do if we learn to trust him. So what I said in that message was, it's not about you, it's about God. It's not about how hard the problem is, it's about God. It's not about how much money you have to solve the problem, it's about God and how he's going to solve it.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the simple comes in. But I'm not suggesting it's simple. I'm not suggesting it's easy to do. I'm not suggesting that at all. And that's the second point of that message goes into faith will stretch you because sometimes it seems foolish.
Right. Yeah.
So what they were asked to do, which we've already touched on a little bit, I really do think there was probably a lot of inquisitive people on the inside who were up on those walls. And I'm sure there were some jeers, just like there was for Noah when he built the ark. I'm sure there were people that were just like, what are you doing? Why is this happening? And it probably felt foolish. If you think about it, let's get the whole family together and go walk around Jericho again.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then your third point was centered around obedience. And
right.
And this morning, for my own personal Bible reading time, I had been listening to the part in the Bible that was talking about Abraham and Isaac, where Abraham went, to sacrifice Isaac, and
Right.
there was no question about his obedience. It was amazing, but that sure was a challenging moment. It had to be for him, but
Right.
yeah.
Well, I think so. The obedience, so that whole thing, that's what God always wanted from Israel. And we won't go too far down this trail, but that's how Israel always failed over and over and over again. They would spend years getting punished for failing. That's the story of the Old Testament, it seems like.
Yeah.
And he would send prophets. He would send people that would, even some kings who supported the law of God, the rule of God, and the people just always had wayward hearts. And the simplicity of it is, it's not simplicity, but the facts of it is, he led them out of Egypt through a miracle at the Red Sea. He fed them manna and quail. He led them by cloud by day and fire by night. Their shoes never wore. When the last generation had to wait 40 years to get to the promised land, their shoes never wore out. So even in their punishment, they were still receiving affirmations from God. If they're looking for signs, they had all kind of signs, but they still had a hard time trusting.
Yeah. I just want to take a moment here to move away from what we're talking about to just mention, I wanted to do this up front. I would encourage anyone who would be watching this to make certain that they take time to go back and listen to the message that you brought on Wednesday. It's a very encouraging, a very uplifting message. And there was another piece to that where you were talking about our obedience, of course. And I wrote down this phrase. I think I'm right about it, but I just wanted to mention it. I think it's impossible to have winning faith if we're disobedient, right? I mean,
True.
If we're disobedient, I don't think we can in any way have a winning faith.
Right.
Yeah. And then number 4, the point there was that testing brings strength to our faith, rather.
Right.
And what you had mentioned about that section was that waiting is part of the test. And man, that can be a really tough element right there.
Waiting time is never wasted time.
Yeah, that's a great phrase, but it's waiting time may never be easy either.
Right. Yeah, and I try to keep things with me, and of course I mentioned this in the message. It's the books on my phone. I'm not a real game person. The only time I'll play games on my phone typically is if I'm in a really stuck place or I'm on an airplane, and I haven't progressed from Angry Birds, so that's 10 years old.
Well, your last point there, Wes, was about satisfying results, and there is absolutely the fact of when we can really exercise faith and then see God at work. It is a very rewarding experience that helps us in our faith journey and in our maturing in that process, for sure. But
yeah, there's just so many great stories, and I know I'm a reader and I know I love history, but even this past year during COVID, I read a lot of historical not novels, but history biographies, a few autobiographies, and then there were some. I read one on Charles Spurgeon's wife, Susie Spurgeon. I read one on a missionary that I can't recall her name right now, who was in the Orient during World War II, landed in prisoner of war camps. She was a nurse, but the things that she endured were just incredible, including losing her husband to death.
Right.
And going through that basically by herself, winding up at the very end. If it wasn't bad enough for the years that she was in and out of those camps and trying to be a nurse for people, at the very end she was under the sentence of death in a horrible prison. I mean,
Yeah.
and you think about all that, and I'm not suggesting nobody wants to go through that, nobody at all. But when the door finally opened, and whether that door leads to death or whether that door leads to life, we always got to remember that whatever the door is, and God, if God's opening it, it's going to be a satisfying result.
Yeah.
And so she, it was just incredible. And I read that and I think, man, my life it's just, and I'm not asking for that, but it's just nothing compared to those. And so we know how God operates, and we know what he can do. We know the stories are just legion that are out there of the power of God that can do so much.
Yeah. Well, just before we wrap it up today, the one other thought that jumps into my mind, and I'm always a bit, I don't know, uncomfortable, I guess is the word I could say, especially I've recently had the experience of coming alongside of a brand new Christian, and they expressed that they had this issue in their life, but they were going to trust God. And I'm always thinking, okay, but man, if this doesn't come through the way that they are expecting God to answer that prayer, what's that going to do to them? Because sometimes what we thought we would get as an answer doesn't happen. What can you say about that?
In regard to what? In regard to not
to the person,
think it's going to be positive, but it's not.
Yeah. The person's faith, who believes that something is definitely going to happen because they're exercising that faith as best they know how, and then it's the opposite.
I think that's where Christian maturity comes in, and we don't teach it very much. And especially if you're in the health and wealth gospel kind of mentality, it's not taught at all. And when people do die, when people do get sick, it's just, well, your faith's not strong enough. And people take it on. It's just crazy because the Bible is full of stories that didn't have happy endings. Now, ultimately they had great endings and happy endings.
Absolutely.
So I think Don, I think of, my mother had a stroke. She served God since she was 8 or 4 or something. I don't know, when she was little. I think of your dad and the way that sort of his life for several years before he passed away. He had been faithful to serve God. You don't get brownie points. It's just life. You live life. And that's harsh. And you don't want to say that when you're standing in the hospital and somebody's lost a baby. I just had a friend of mine from work who's dealt with cancer for 2 years, send an email, and the numbers aren't what they should be. And it's going to be, and then she's just a mess in her own words. And I think those kind of things, there aren't answers. And I can sit here, I don't want to be cavalier about it at all, but I find also great courage in it. But you got to tell people the promise is eternal. Yeah, that's where the tears stop. That's where things end. I'm going to be preaching in 3 weeks at our church on the last verse of Psalm 23, and it says, "I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever." Well, right before that, it says, "Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life." Yeah. Even in those 2 words, it's not a promise that you're not going to get sick. Yeah. It's not a promise that you're not going to have some financial difficulty. Not a promise that your washing machine and dryer are not going to break. Yeah. Or your car. So. Yeah, I get that. So one other thought that just hit me that maybe somebody would be thinking today, and that is, so it's gonna come out however it's gonna come out. So why do I need to even exercise my faith? Because it's gonna be what it's gonna be. That might be the thought. Yeah, well, and that's sort of the fatalistic end of it. I think what you want. Well, that's what I was going to try to say. So it says, "I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever," and you do that eternally by dwelling in the house of the Lord now. Yeah, and that means keeping yourself under His protection, keeping yourself under his roof. And again, it doesn't mean that everybody that it's a perfect scenario here on this earth. It's perfect later.
Yes.
But you're still going to have tears even in the Father's house here. And someday the tears will all be wiped from your eyes.
Yeah.
But for this little season, we endure it. And again, I'm talking right now as a relatively healthy person. And so it's really easy for me to sit here and talk about this. But I try to keep myself aware of people that are suffering, that are hurting, that
Sure.
God gives them this miraculous ability to somehow tap into him. And it's enough.
Yeah.
It just seems to be enough. And I don't think it's the fatalistic, well, what's it matter? He's going to do what it's not that. It's, God, thank you for being here, and thank you for not forsaking me and leaving me. And again, it's the elderly lady that I prayed with a few weeks ago who died 3 hours later. She was a former pastor's wife. She was in her late 80s, middle to late 80s. She lived a great life in many, many ways, but she was tired and the treatments were not worth it. And she just wanted to go home.
Sure.
And she did.
Yeah. Yeah.
And she went from sitting on the couch to laying down in the bed, and she didn't give hospice a chance to earn their money because she just went on to be with Jesus.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, man, oh man. I just love this sermon, and thank you so much for sharing it on Wednesday. And I want to again encourage people that are watching what we have done in the way of our talks today to go back and just review it. They can go to your Facebook page, or you have a page called MidWeek Encounter. Yeah.
Right.
And the message is posted there. It's on your personal page. It's on mine as well. So
and then I have a website that's there, and it's on a YouTube channel. So
yeah, lots of ways for them to access it.
Let me end with one story. I ended the sermon Sunday from the church where I spoke with this story, and I didn't mention it when I was going through this, but I love it because this is who God is for me. There was a guy, it was a former linebacker for the Miami Dolphins, and he was asked by his coach to do some recruiting for the college level. He said, "Sure, coach, what kind of player are you looking for?" And the coach said, "Well, Mike, there's the fellow who gets knocked down and just stays down." And Mike said, "Yeah, we don't want him, do we?" And the coach said, "No, we don't want him." Then there's the person that gets knocked down and gets up and gets knocked down again and stays down. "Well, we don't want him. No, we don't want him." And then the coach said, "Well, then there's the fellow who gets knocked down, he gets back up, he gets knocked down, he gets back up, he gets knocked down." And Mike said, "That's the guy we want." And the coach said, "No, we don't want him either." And he said, "Well, who do you want?" He said, "I want you to find the guy that's knocking everybody else down. That's the guy we want." And you and I don't have the power to knock anything down.
Right.
Sometimes we think we do. We feel, we don't have the power. But with God, all things are possible.
Yeah.
All things.
Yeah. So our faith and our confidence is in him.
Exactly.
And he's the one who can manage this life for us better than we ever could ourselves.
If you want to use the I word, it has to be followed with, "I can do all things through Christ who strengthens me."
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, man, this was good stuff. Thanks, Wes, for taking time today.
All right. See you
We'll
soon.
see you next week.
Thank you.
Thanks for watching. Take a moment to share with your friends.